Welcome to Ideas in Action, the official University of Southern California podcast. This show was recorded live on USC's campus.
Welcome to USC Facebook Live. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today to talk about Juneteenth. I'm Elena Morgan, and I'm assistant professor in the Department of History here at USC. I'm joined by two of my colleagues at USC who will introduce themselves in just a moment. But we're here because in just a few days, on Saturday, people around the country will celebrate Juneteenth, which marks the day in 1865 when word of emancipation finally reached slaves in Galveston, Texas, a full year and a half after President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation became law, right? So a little bit about me. I'm a historian of the African diaspora, and my research focuses on the historic role of religion, in particular Islam, in racial liberation movements of the mid to late 20th century Atlantic world. And now I'll turn it over to Christian Gross to introduce himself.
Hey, thanks. I'm Christian Gross, and I'm an associate professor of political science and public policy here at USC. I study voting rights and race and ethnicity and campaigns and elections in the United States. I am currently the academic director of the USC Schwarzenegger Institute for State and Global Policy. And this past year, we did a program administering grants to localities in former Voting Rights Act Section 5 states to open polling places. And I'm doing some research and writing about that experience now. And now I'm going to pass it over to our colleague, Jody Armour.
Thank you. I'm Jody Armour. I'm the Roy P. Crocker Professor of Law at Gould School of Law. I concentrate on the rule of law, race, legal decision-making, and language as well. And I will now pass it back to my colleagues.
Okay, so I'm going to kick off our conversation today with a question for you, Jody. The United States Senate just this week passed a bill to make Juneteenth a federal holiday. So what do you think of the timing of this move, and what does it say about our country's reckoning with our long, long history of racial injustice?
Yeah, it was unanimous at the Senate level, right? Unanimous decision coming out of the Senate. The House also approved the recognition of Juneteenth as a federal holiday, not with unanimity, but with a wide disparity. I think there were only 14 or so votes against, all the rest in favor of. And so you could spin this as a very kind of positive story, a feel-good story, the kind of story that a lot of people had, the kind of narrative that was being spun after Obama got elected. Hey, we're post-racial. Now we're post-racial officially, 2008. I think there may be some people say, well, we're recognizing Juneteenth now, so come on, that should be sufficient for us to, kind of move on now. Let's just get along and move on. When of course that is not at all what's going on. To the contrary, this holiday gives us an opportunity to connect the American Revolution in 1776 to the Second American Revolution, the one that we call the Civil War, the one that Lincoln stood in Gettysburg and talked about when he said 77 years ago, our fathers founded a nation in liberty and equality, right? But that promise was flagrantly flouted for the next 80 years until we had a cataclysmic race war with 600,000 to 700,000 dead Americans, right? That Juneteenth is celebrating the promise of the first revolution being brought to a greater fruition in the second revolution, the Civil War, that said that at least Black people are no longer chattel slaves. We may not be there yet, but at least we've gotten out of that yoke and officially extended to them a recognition as more than chattel slaves. So at this moment of our racial reckoning, I think of the fact, just real quickly, that it's controversial whether you can teach this stuff in schools. The number of legislatures around the country, 15 at last count, are stepping in and saying America has racism at its foundation is forbidden. We don't want you saying that. And we don't want you saying things that are going to cast America in a negative light historically. So I don't know how in those jurisdictions they're going to explain to their high school, middle school, and grade school students when they ask them what Juneteenth is, how they're going to explain why we're celebrating Juneteenth without mentioning slavery. I'm not quite sure about that. But Annalisa, can you tell, what is your take on this? You thought a lot more about this than I have, for sure. And so I'd really be interested in your take on this moment of symbolism. Many people are saying, "Oh, this is just hollow symbolism. I don't want to hear anything about hollow symbolism." But that's not what they were saying when they were saying we want to get those Confederate flags from flying over the state houses and we want to get those Confederate monuments down. Then they were saying, "Yeah, we recognize that public symbolism is important. And right, it's something that we should take seriously." So what do you think? I'm interested in your insights at this moment.
Right. So I think you meant Elena, but
I'm sorry, Elena.
No, it's fine. It's okay. I think that one of the things that's really interesting about like this particular moment is that what we're having really is a conversation about what our values are as a nation and what are the types of things that we are going to hold dear to us and to memorialize and to symbolize right now, right? And so I think that in this part of this conversation, it's very interesting, right? Because I think that since last summer, it doesn't really seem like anybody, as you said, is publicly disparaging Juneteenth. I don't think that there really has been anybody that is seriously saying this is not something that we should care about. This is not something that we should look at, right? This is not something that is important at all, right? But I do think, right, that the question that you bring up of what is going to be taught in these particular jurisdictions, right, that are placing restrictions, right, that are continuing to place restrictions on full citizenship for Black people, for Brown people, for poor people, right? What are the types of things that are going to be taught in those particular jurisdictions, right? One of the things that I think is particularly interesting about this issue of memorialization, when we look at in some of these jurisdictions, right, that are in the process, right, of further dismantling of like the last piece of the Voting Rights Act, right, that's still intact, they are now just destroying it, right? That a lot of these statues, right, that these Confederate statues that people are so upset, right, that people are tearing down, right? And some of this conversation that they're having about, oh, like this is our history, this is the way that we memorialize things, this is what we stand for. So many of these were placed in public places from the 1920s to the 1940s, way after the Civil War, as we were in a period of mass mobilization against lynching, against racial injustice, right on the heels of, right on the cusp of the civil rights movement, right? These are not monuments really to Confederate history so much as they are monuments to white supremacy and to intimidation, right? And so I think that, with this conversation around Juneteenth, some of the things that I've been really, really interested in is the symbolism, right? And is the memorialization, and is this move to reframe what it is that's important to us as a country, right? And I think that some of this conversation about, oh, this is our history, right? Our values change as a nation. And I think that the conversations that we have and the holidays that we have should also change as well. But with that said, Christian, I want to ask you a question about, because, we've been kind of dancing around this idea of what it is, right? We had a unanimous Senate decision, right? Which is pretty interesting, right? But we're in the process of rolling back voting rights in so many jurisdictions. So can you speak a little bit about what it is that this really means, and some of like the struggle that really is happening behind the scenes for full democratic participation.
Yeah, thanks. This has been really interesting. When I think about the move towards recognizing Juneteenth at the federal level, that's happening right now. And yes, the unanimous consent agreement was reached last year. Senator Ron Johnson objected to that, and this year made a statement saying he did not choose to. So the unanimity even came from those who in the past had not supported. I think that's interesting, and I think it's really a sign of things moving in a good direction. The fact that the Senate and the House are actually passing a federal holiday. If you look at the last 20 years of state legislatures, most have not had holidays for Juneteenth, but almost all have recognized Juneteenth, and it's all happened in the last several years. But at the same time, there's been substantive movement backwards in some directions, like in voting rights. So one thing I would keep an eye on is how, even though like the historic recognition of Juneteenth is so much better than the historic recognition of, say, the Robert E. Lee holiday, which in Arkansas was still part of the MLK Day until a couple of years ago, for instance, right? That's an advance. That is progression in the country to be recognizing Juneteenth instead of the Robert E. Lee holiday. But it's very symbolic, right? And does it actually does it mean anything for voting rights? Does it mean anything for substantive policy reform? I'm not sure. A lot of times legislators can take symbolic positions that are popular on racial issues in order to actually avoid making substantive policy changes that maybe are a little more controversial but important. And so I think, we think about voting rights. Texas, where Juneteenth started, the state legislature has been trying to curb voting rights in pretty serious ways, right? Making it harder for localities to open drop boxes. In Harris County, Texas, where Houston is located, the proposed legislation, which was blocked in the session recently, would make it a lot harder for that county to open polling places and drop boxes in communities of color, and that also happened in the 2020 election. So I think and then this is happening in Georgia, and proposed bills in North Carolina and other states as well. And then at the federal level, right, the Voting Rights Act extension of Section 5 is currently being proposed, and Joe Manchin has made some statements about supporting Section 5 coverage of the entire country as part of a compromise bill. But I think that is perhaps more substantively important than the unanimous Juneteenth resolution, even though that's still important too. And so, Jody, I was just curious what you thought about this, especially thinking about police reform and other policies, and thinking about substantive movements where we have and have not seen changes going parallel to this move to celebrate Juneteenth.
Yeah, it's an important issue that comes up again and again. How do you distinguish hollow symbolism, performative politics, from real and lasting interventions that move the needle? And, there are times when all you're getting is hollow symbolism. And I recognize the concern that many have about that. There was the embarrassment, for example, last year around this time when the George Floyd bill was introduced in DC, and Congress people put kente cloth stoles on and knelt, and there was a lot of dragging on Twitter and social media of that kind of performative and embarrassingly hollow display. And so I can understand why people pause and say that standing alone shouldn't be enough. But there are times when struggles over symbols and their meanings are core parts of the political process. It's over symbols and their meanings that people unify and rally as collective actors a lot of times and push for real, lasting political change. You don't get, numbers without unity in a democracy are meaningless, right? You can have all the numbers in the world. You're not going to, and power is wielded through numbers, but numbers without unity, without, collective action are meaningless, right? So how do you get people to unify, to rally together? It's often through symbolism, through, say it loud, I'm Black and I'm proud, women unite, take back the night, Black is beautiful, Black Lives Matter. I mean, there's a lot of symbolism that is very much core to political activism and political action. So I don't want to draw this distinction necessarily between symbols and action. Sometimes symbolic work is a kind of important, part of political action. But I hear you. We do have to be on guard against, hollow symbolism robbing us of real change, which often happens too. We have to remain super vigilant about that. So there's no easy formula. We just have to stay vigilant and take it on, I think, more of a case-by-case basis. Elena, what do you think? I'm back to you because for me, I listen closely to what you're saying on this issue. So what do you think about what Christian and I are coming down on in this?
Right. I mean, I think that I would agree. I think that I would agree with you that it's really important to make sure that this particular symbolic victory doesn't distract us from the larger work that we need to do in terms of racial injustice in this country, right? And I think that going back to what we were saying before, that this might be a strategy that some more conservative politicians are using, right? Voting unanimously to make this a holiday. Because yes, memorialization is incredibly important and symbolism is incredibly important. But by just saying, okay, we're going to make this a holiday, and then not doing anything else, right? We leave intact the structures that contribute to racial injustice and racial inequality in this country, right? Making Juneteenth a federal holiday is not going to change the fact that Black Americans disproportionately died from COVID. It's not going to change the fact, right, that when our students come into our classrooms, they don't see people that look like me, right? That look like you, Jody, right? So, I mean, it doesn't change the fact that, right, that so many of my students are like, we didn't know that a professor could be young and Black and female, right? It doesn't change those things, right? So I think that it's such a danger, right? And we need to keep our eyes open at all times. That being said, I want to talk about also historically the fact that symbols, particularly symbols that people have rallied around particular symbols, that these have driven unity and driven social movements, right? And that in particular, right, in my research, when I look at how I look at not only, for instance, how people converted to Islam as a way to push forward social justice and equality, but how non-Muslims actually used Islam, right, as a symbol of justice, right? How they looked toward that. And so I think that symbolism can be super, super powerful, Jody, as you were saying. And so I don't want to knock that at all. I think that it has historical precedent. But I also think, that we're at a moment where we have the ability to keep our eye on the prize and to make real change. And we need to keep our foot on the gas, not take it off, right? And be distracted by anything that might, get in the way. I think that this is one small victory on the road to what we need to be many, many, many victories. So I want to turn the conversation to, I think that we lose Chris? I think that we might have lost Christian for a moment.
We're waiting for him to come back. Elena, let me go with you on your point that I like a lot. Your points that I like a lot. That we don't, lose track of substantive change by getting too much caught up in hollow symbolism. I think Juneteenth may be more than hollow symbolism. It all depends on what we do with it, of course, right? But I think it may be helpful, at least in this regard. When you get 100%, when you get not 100%, when you get unanimity with some extensions from the senators on the recognition of Juneteenth as an official national, federal public holiday. Collective symbolism, public symbolism is hard at work now at that point, right? How do those same senators go back to their jurisdictions and support bills, like I said before, that say, we don't want to talk about slavery? Be careful if you talk about systemic racism. Be careful if you say anything about racism being at the foundation of America. Well, look, Juneteenth is about racism being at the foundation of America. It's in the Constitution, right? It doesn't get no more foundational than that, folks. Right? So at least it creates that kind of glaring cognitive dissonance, doesn't it? At least it presents the possibility. I don't know, what is your sense, Christian?
Yeah, I think that the memorialization of it at the federal level is pretty big. And I do think that, the idea that the Senate is unanimous with this and there's so many House members, especially given their varying views substantively, is pretty surprising in some ways. And so I think that's something that's really contrary to everything else that's going on, right? With the attempted bans at critical race theory, trying to dictate what can be taught in public schools. Some of that I think is actually just kind of ridiculous, because it's how can you dictate what, like, the teaching of theory? That's almost hard to do without, if you're teaching, like, you're going to be discussing theory. I find it a little bit of cognitive dissonance, right? That it's this. I know earlier I said that there's, this is a fairly symbolic move and isn't that substantive, but it does sort of contrast with a lot of other symbolic moves to ban things, to ban teaching of slavery in schools, to ban teaching of critical race theory. I think that's, in some ways it's just the way the United States is, right? Like the US is not going forward or backward. We often are going forward and backward at the same time, right? In different directions. And so I think this squares with that. What about you, Elena?
Yeah, I'm really interested actually to think about actually what you just said, Christian, which goes into this question about theory. I think that somebody from the audience had a question about kind of the backlash to critical race theory, and the question about would we even be talking about Juneteenth without critical race theory, right? Like, what is the relationship of theory to action and social change, right? For me, I think that the backlash to critical race theory goes to the root of so much of what we've been talking about, right? That ultimately it requires acceptance that this country was founded on basically racist principles, right? That it is that at the core that there are structures which support the subjugation of certain people, and that if we continue, that white supremacy wins, essentially, right? And so I think that this is very difficult for people to accept, because it requires for those who are in power to give up some of that power. And I think that they are extremely resistant to it. I also think that there are people who look like people who are in power who have been made to believe that if they just put their nose to the grindstone and keep on working and, emulate these people, that they too can be in power one day, right? And we know that isn't true, right? People tend to stay in their same social classes, right? A lot of people don't even leave, right, the places that they were born, right? So I think that critical race theory upends so much about the American narrative of progress, right, personal progress, and the American dream. And I think that that's part of the backlash to it. Would we even be talking about Juneteenth without it? I don't know. I'm not a theory head. I'm a historian, so I'm not a theory head, right? As historians, for me, good theory comes from practice, right? Like it comes from like the realities that are in front of you. So theory for me organizes the thoughts that you have about facts, right? About what you see in the world. And so I think that we would be talking about it in a sense. I think that critical race theory gives us a framework in order to articulate exactly what the benefits and the problems are. What can I ask, Christian, what do you kind of, or you know what, since you kicked it to me, Jody, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that, as someone who's been writing critical race theory for about 25 years, and I'm getting ready to teach it at a public university in Florida where they've outlawed critical race theory. So I guess my students are going to have to wrap my books in cheesecloth and smuggle them into the classroom while we traffic in transgressive utterances such as systemic racism and unconscious bias and white supremacy. But I don't see critical race theory as having given rise to Juneteenth, because a lot of the people even who support Juneteenth are critical of critical race theory, right? What Juneteenth is a product of, what we're celebrating now, is what it is a product of, is that generational upheaval we saw on these streets last year this time. That's 6 weeks in a row out here in LA, day in and day out, right? That reverberated, at the ballot boxes with bringing in George Gascon and ousting Jackie Lacey and bringing in Measure J, which is a defund the police measure by a different name, 10% of the county's unrestricted funds, up to, are you still there? Yeah, up to, the county unrestricted budget up to $10 billion a year. So that's up to $1 billion a year to non-incarceration alternatives. Those kinds of, jaw-dropping changes came from the activism, the grassroots activism in the street over the summer. And we're seeing it with Larry Krasner, being beaten down, his primary challenger as a progressive prosecutor in Philadelphia, even though people were saying, oh, spikes in crime mean people are going to blame progressive prosecutors. This movement has legs. And Juneteenth is yet another expression of the legs that this movement that we've all been a witness to, that has had Black women at its vanguard, because that's what Black Lives Matter is really driven by. It's a leaderful movement, not a leaderless movement. But among those leaders in Black Lives Matter, the ones I see doing the work and representing, unrelentingly are Black women and LGBTQ folk, right? So I think when I think about this Juneteenth moment that we're in right now, I think about the victories and triumphs that can come from grassroots organizing and political activism. That's kind of what comes to me. But you study political animals day in and day out, Christian. So what do you think about the political part of thinking about how we got to this moment where we have so many Congress folk who otherwise are not supportive of critical race theory, but they are supportive of Juneteenth?
Yeah, I mean, I think on the critical race theory, I think it's just taken to elected officials. It doesn't actually mean what we think of the term in academia. It's just a catch-all for sort of, this is something that I want to ban, right? And a lot of legislators are doing that, and to me, it just doesn't make any sense. Like it's like banning discussion in a classroom on anything, right? I mean, like, how can you ban discussing theory? How can you ban discussing race when you're discussing the United States? It doesn't make any sense. And if that actually happens, it's a real problem for students, right, of America. And one of the things I think, like, if we thinking about what we do at USC and what we do as academics, is we think and theorize and talk about uncomfortable things. We talk about race. How could you study the United States without engaging critical race theory? It doesn't make any sense. So I don't know. That's my like less nuanced take on the bills. But I do think, why are they doing it? I mean, I think they're doing it because it's a way to basically sort of create a sort of a catch-all phrase that doesn't really, that's not really what critical race theory is. It's not really what we're doing in the classroom and what people are teaching. And and in some ways it's kind of scary because it does harken back to the attempts to ban speech, to ban thought, to the way we think about things. And, what we do at a university, what we do at USC is talk about ideas and talk about them freely. And the idea of not discussing certain topics is pretty bad. And so that's my thought on it, but not as nuanced on why are they doing it.
But Christian and Elena, what do you think about this push? Let me push back a little bit. Let me channel some of my Fox News for a moment and ask you this. Although I'm not tarring with the same brush everyone over at Fox. They have some very good reporters actually, but there's a perspective that they've taken a stance politically for some time, and one of those is that critical race theories, at least the national level, you hear them saying critical race theory not only is about racism being foundational to America, they have a problem with that too, but okay, it's also teaching white people and white children that whites are villains. It's villainizing white people, right? And nobody should be villainized because of their race. Right? This is what I hear again and again. I try to kind of dial into where they're coming from, because sometimes I think it's hard for us to understand if we're in our own kind of more progressive, inclusive, spaces where other people, what they might even be thinking. So I try to understand. I try to tell my students, if you're taking on a case, you need to write a brief for the other side that's more eloquent than they can write, and then take out that brief, right? So from their perspective, that's where they seem to be coming from. You're villainizing white people. You're teaching white children to think of themselves as villains. How do you respond to that?
I don't think that. So I think that what's being villainized, right, is white supremacy, not whiteness, right? But I also think that we have to understand, right, that all of these things are constructions, right? Like whiteness is a construction. And it is a way to frame power, right, over particular people. I think that nobody wants to villainize white children, right? Like nobody is I think that this is valid, right? Like nobody is inherently bad, right? Nobody is inherently evil because of their skin color or their race. We certainly don't want to flip the script and now make just another racial group, right, villainized. But that does not take away the history and the reality of what white people and white supremacy has done in order to subjugate Black people, right? And everybody needs to reckon with that history. And I think that we have, right, as we wrap up here, we have a question from the audience about what's the metric, right, of measurement for the end game, right? And for me, the measurement of the metric of measurement for the end game is if we get to a place where everybody is working to transform this country in a way that makes it more equitable. That to me is the end game, right? Like, and we can only kind of get to, right, I can only get to a place like where I'm educating people about the history of racism and race in this country, and hoping that they take that with them into their careers and their lives, right? And that they use that to make transformational change. Christian, what do you think as we wrap up here?
Yeah, I mean, just think about like, what is the end game? Like, what is I think something, bringing it back to Juneteenth, would be to think about not just Juneteenth as a celebration and the history. That's while super important, to also think about what goes forward in the future, right? And so I think, the idea, I mean, for me, the idea, coming back to this critical race theory discussion and just the idea of banning what's discussed in classrooms, I think that's the kind of thing that we need to remember. We need to make sure we have free and open discussion about all scholarly and academic topics, and the idea of bans on critical race theory is troubling. And so I don't know, that's not much of an end. What is the end game? But I mean, one end game would be have more symbolic measures like Juneteenth holidays and less banning of critical race theory is a very small end game, but that would be something. And then just think about substantive change. Like, what substantive change? I echo what you were saying, Elena. What could be done in the future about voting rights, police reform, actual equitable outcomes in policy, and not only important symbolic measures like Juneteenth. What about you, Jody?
Well, yeah, for me, the end game is fairly straightforward and simple. I need to be able to walk down Skid Row here in LA, the fiercest expression of structural violence in America, the highest concentration of houseless folk in America. I need to be able to walk down those streets and not turn to the left and right and see 75% of those faces Black. I need to be able to go into San Quentin, take my students into San Quentin and not see racial demographics that are similar to Skid Row. I need to go into some of these hospitals and not see COVID raging through Black bodies disproportionately, right? I need to look at a lot of very simple, straightforward, concrete stuff and say, when I stop seeing Black faces grossly disproportionately in the bowels of this nation's misery, the misery index for Black folks has gotten better for some like me, people living in View Park, people who are the Black bourgeoisie, the Black middle class. Life is better than ever for us. But like I just told you, go walk through Skid Row and you see for many of our brothers and sisters, things have never been worse. And figuring out how to solve that, and recognizing that the solution to that is going to take a radical overhaul, a revolution in consciousness, the way we're seeing it happen in criminal justice system, for example, where we've moved away from retribution, retaliation, and revenge as our moral framework and moral compass when it comes to criminal matters, toward restoration, rehabilitation, and redemption. Right? That's what Gascon came in on. Jackie Lacey hewed to the old law and order, tough on crime. The voters said no. Proposition 47, no. Chesa Boudin, Larry Krasner. We've fundamentally shifted our moral framework when it comes to blame and punishment, because that's the only way we're going to do anything about racialized mass incarceration or the new Jim Crow. So those kind of revolutions in consciousness are what I'm going to have to see for us to turn things around for places like Skid Row and San Quentin.
Yeah, Jody, I think that's a beautiful place to stop. So I loved having a conversation with you guys. I hope that we can continue to have more conversations in person again now that COVID is ebbing. And so we are out of time. Everybody, thank you so much to my co-hosts, and thank you to our audience for joining us here on USC Facebook Live. See you guys all soon.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast and visit us at podcast.usc.edu.